Well, we started out the month of April talking about the spiritual journey of Charles Fillmore and Albert Einstein. They had some very similar ideas about a new way of thinking about God. You might remember that Albert Einstein said that he wanted to know how God created this world. He said, I'm not interested in this or that phenomenon, in the spectrum of this or that element. I want to know his thoughts. The rest are details. And then we had Charles Fillmore, who talked about God as mind. And Charles Fillmore said, by the term mind, we mean God, the universal principle which includes all principles. God is the original mind in which all real ideas exist. These were radical ideas. This was back in the late 18th century, and a lot of people in those days still thought of God as the invisible male entity in the sky who had human emotions, a God who could be persuaded to do good things for us if we said the right words or performed the right rituals and things like that. Well, Albert and Charles had a different idea. They were on a mission to raise consciousness. And they were doing that by showing us a brand new concept of God. Now, there is just one slight problem, if you want to call it that, with this new approach, because as soon as we start hearing words like mind, thought, ideas, or even consciousness as applied to God, how do we define those words? Don't we define them according to our human experience? When we hear those words, we're thinking, well, it must be like my mind, or my thoughts, or my experience of consciousness. If we refer to God as mind, then for us human beings, really the only model that we have for how mind operates is our own. Sometimes we end up getting in our own way. We get in the way of our own growth because of the words that we use, and that's just a part of the human journey. It's something that we have to be aware of. We can get in our own way, as strange as that may sound. Words and language are wonderful things. They're two things that really set us apart from every other sentient living thing that we're aware of. But words and language can also limit us if we're not careful. Our words can stand in the way of having a deeper understanding of God or ultimate reality. And our words and language can really stand in the way of having a deeper understanding of one another. Peace on earth, we sing that every Sunday at the end of the service. Peace on earth doesn't stand a chance if we can't learn to get along with each other, and peace starts with understanding. So here's an example of how language and conditioning can get in the way of understanding and peace on earth. I'm going to say a word, and then I want you to immediately follow it with the very next word that comes into your mind, okay? Are you ready? Here's the word. Islamic. Fill in the blank. Don't say it out loud. You don't have to raise your hand or anything. I wonder, how many of us came up with the word terrorist, extremist, radical, fundamentalist? It's difficult, especially after last week, when our news media and our politicians create this kind of echo chamber that is meant to simply amplify our worst fears and prejudices. Words can be liberating, and words can be limiting. I'm thinking that maybe this is what Paul was getting at when he wrote that letter that we call Romans. It contains one of his best known quotes, and it's the one that goes like this. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your minds, so that you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. When Karen and I were ordained back in 2004, back at Unity Village, as each member of our class would walk up to the stage, they would put your picture up on this huge screen, and they would also put up next to that your favorite quote, whatever it happened to be. It didn't have to come from the Bible necessarily, but this one showed up several times, and I've noticed that over the years at the ordinations that I've been to since then, that this is the quote that seems to appear the most. Because at a most basic level, it's reminding us of the need to examine our conditioned way of thinking. Our definitions, our word associations, our prejudices, our negative stereotypes, they all take the form of words, and they have their beginning in thought. That's where it all starts. So, if we want to raise consciousness, we have to change our thought patterns. And it takes work. We have to work on ourselves first. And believe it or not, that is counterintuitive. It's part of human nature to focus on the outer world. If something is bothering us, our instinctive reaction is to try to change the external conditions. Feeling unhappy? Feeling unfulfilled? Well, doesn't our culture tell us that most of the time the solution is something new, a fancier car, a bigger house, right? Our culture tells us in so many ways that you don't mean a thing if you don't have a lot of bling, right? We get that message. We're inundated with this message. Paul is telling us to raise our consciousness. And it's crucial because we will experience life exactly according to our current level of consciousness. If someone is doing something that drives you nuts, that's not an invitation to try to change them. It's an invitation to examine what's happening at the level of your own consciousness. But instead of doing that, how often do we do something else? Instead of looking within, how often do we go around and try to gather evidence? And we go up to other people and we say, "Oh, ain't it awful? Ain't it awful?" And if they don't think it's awful, then we say, "Well, you should think it's awful, and here's why." And we proceed to gather evidence and to enroll other people into our way of thinking. And we do this stuff for a couple of reasons. I mentioned before that it seems to be instinctive. It's part of human nature. It's habitual, and it's really hard to break that kind of habit. We really want other people to share our opinion about the thing or the people that we disapprove of. So we try to enroll allies in our crusade to stamp out whatever it is that we disapprove of or label as awful. And more often than not, we take that kind of a backdoor approach because we can't deal with the person or the situation directly in a positive or constructive way, or more likely, because we can't deal with our own prejudices, our own habitual ways of thinking, and sometimes just our own plain narrow-mindedness. We can't conceive of a person or a situation that doesn't conform to our interpretation of how things ought to be. And boy, that just causes a lot of problems in the world, and it really is the biggest source of our own suffering. Raising consciousness is hard. Blaming others is easy. Challenging our own assumptions and conclusions is hard. Enrolling others and gathering evidence is easy. And a lot of times we do this just because we're asleep. We really don't know any better. Hey, this is the way that the world has taught us to operate. And we are conformed to the way this world operates, which is just the opposite of what Paul was trying to tell us. Our level of consciousness forms our thoughts. Our thoughts become words which have the power to liberate or enslave. Our words can literally create chains that we can use to bind another person with our judgments and opinions. That's how words can enslave. You know, Mother's Day is coming up here in a couple of weeks. What was it that Mom used to say? If you can't say something nice, don't say anything at all, right? Our calling in Unity is to raise consciousness, to be living and breathing examples of what that looks like in the world. So, when terrible things happen in the world and around us, when people do things that we disagree with, our calling is to expand our perspective. Albert Einstein, he said something else that I'm sure you're all familiar with. He said, "You can't solve problems with the same level of consciousness that created them." We can't expect anything in the external to change unless we're willing to be transformed by the renewing of our minds, which means we change ourselves, we change the way we think. Back in January, we studied something called spiritual intelligence. And one aspect of spiritual intelligence is our commitment to spiritual growth. Raising consciousness is a big part of what spiritual growth is all about. Now, our Sunday adult study group, which meets before this service, they've been working with the book Discover the Power Within You by Eric Butterworth, the late Eric Butterworth, a very well-known Unity minister and author. And chapter 3 of that book is called The Great Decision. And Eric talks about how some people try to find a church or a spiritual center that doesn't make people think or doesn't try to help people to change the way they think. He compares that to an engineering school that doesn't require students to do anything or change the way they think. He says if there were such a school, it would be a waste of time and money to enroll in it. Ain't that the truth? Eric tells us that the great decision we have to make is choosing where to look for happiness and peace of mind. By changing stuff out there or within. By making the change within. Tough decision. Our culture has a domineering message which says it's all about the outer. Change the outer conditions, change others, you'll be happy. It don't work that way. Transformation, it's an inside job. Raised consciousness, I mean, it may sound kind of, all metaphysically and complicated and stuff like that, but raised consciousness is really, at its most basic level, being able to take multiple perspectives. That's another one of the skills of spiritual intelligence that we talked about last January. Can we work to understand the emotions and perspectives of others even if we disagree with them? Can we accept the possibility? Can we just accept the possibility that our worldview is simply that, a worldview. One worldview among many that may not necessarily agree with each other. You know what a terrorist is? A terrorist is someone who thinks they have to blow up the world because it doesn't conform to their worldview. And it's the ultimate form of narcissism when you think about it. A narcissist is incapable of seeing the world through the eyes of another, is incapable of taking another person's perspective, is incapable of walking for a mile in the other person's moccasins, as the old Indian saying goes. Can't do that. All that exists is their own viewpoint. Anything else is a threat that has to be eradicated by destruction or something that they have to run away from or withdraw from. Now there's another part of that quote from Paul that doesn't get quite as much attention, but I think it's just as important. It's the part where he says, so that you may discern the will of God. So that you may discern the will of God. There's that personal responsibility again. Don't let someone else tell you what to think and what to do. Just another cop-out. Just another way of being conformed to this world. Another surefire way to stifle transformation and spiritual growth is to expect an authority figure or a holy book to tell you what to think or do. And teachers and books, they're great. They can be very helpful. But if we don't internalize it and make the teaching our own by examining it, by questioning it, and then owning it and practicing it, it becomes just another kind of conformity. We get to decide. We get to discern. But first we raise consciousness. We get the ego out of the way. Because it's the ego that likes to tell us that my way is really the best way. My way is actually the only way. And it's a few short steps from that position to say that it's the way that must be defended with my last breath. Once the ego is out of the way, that's when we can begin that discernment process. Paul says that what we're discerning is the will of God. And this is the definition that I like best of the will of God. The will of God is only that we come to know that we are co-creators, that we come to know our own part as conscious entities and manifestations of mind, and then trust that power and use it for good. Trust and action are what go together. And a big part of the good that we can do is to learn how to be living examples of that raised consciousness. It starts out as a personal journey, but it goes way, way beyond that. At root, the situation we face in the world today is not a political crisis. It's not an ecological crisis. It's not a financial crisis. It is a crisis of consciousness. And it all starts with the way we treat each other, the way we talk about each other, the way we think about each other. The old way of operating, obviously, look around us. The old way of operating is no longer working. So, we can either rearrange the deck chairs on the proverbial Titanic and slowly sink, or we can radically change the way we approach the challenges that we have and do it from the inside out, which means we radically change the way we think by challenging our opinions, our judgments, our prejudices, our conclusions, and everything else that pops into our heads as we go through life. But as we say, and this is guaranteed, as we raise consciousness, everything else follows. And as Pierre Teilhard once said, everything that rises must converge. See you next week.